All right. So good evening from Wolfville and Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, and welcome to 2021. We are excited to be kicking off our virtual program with this evening's event and happy to see so many people. As you come in, please mute yourselves and disable your cameras. A few people who joined us, I did go ahead and mute you so that if you've discovered you're muted, that's why. The number joining us this evening makes me think that the topic is, I don't know, of some interest to many. So I'm excited to see how the conversation will go. I'd like to acknowledge have many special guests on the line this evening, and I believe that the president of the university, Dr. Ricketts, is joining us, along with several others. I draw your attention to the show participants list, and it's the little icon that resembles a person, and you can click on that and see all of whom have joined us. Just as if we were meeting in person at an actual live event and we're wearing name tags. Additionally, the washrooms are down the hallway. Just 2 days before the inauguration of the next president of the United States, we are joined by panelists to discuss the mechanics of the election in general, along with some individual perspectives and opinions on the US election, the good, the bad, and the ugly. My name is Oonagh Proudfoot, and I'm the Executive Director of Alumni Affairs in the Office of Advancement at Acadia, and I'm delighted to be here to speak. There are 3 panelists whom I will introduce shortly. Again, just a couple of housekeeping items. Already have mentioned to ask you to mute yourselves and disable your cameras, just so that we can focus on those who are speaking and presenting at the time. If you launch your chat function, which is the little icon that looks like a conversation in a cartoon strip, that will allow you to ask your questions either in the chat function if you wish. Once we do some preliminary introductions, I also encourage you, if you're comfortable, to come off microphone muted and ask your question live if you wish. We've entered all of your names into a draw for a little prize to be sent along to the winner of that draw. And I've done a couple of names so that in case the person who was number 1 isn't on the line, we'll move on to the second one. And now please join me in welcoming our guest speakers. Mr. Paul Black, class 2000, is an immigrant from the troubles of Northern Ireland. He lived a life of great good fortune in Canada. Paul did his BA honors at Acadia in political science and his master's in political science at Dalhousie, and executive education in Canada, the US, UK, India, and South Africa. He was in government, business with NGOs, and provides counsel to a variety of private and public entities. Paul has worked as a senior staff person to the premiers of Manitoba and Nova Scotia and teaches part-time at Acadia. In Paul's short life so far, he has lived in Northern Ireland, Manitoba, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, and currently resides in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Next up is Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, who is a member of our faculty at Acadia in the Department of Politics. He specializes in judicial politics, international law, and the Middle East. He has also written widely on the subject of campus free speech and has published in the Washington Post, the Niskanen Center, and Heterodox Academy, to name a few. Dr. Sachs lives in Wolfville with his family. And Ms. Meg Cuming, who is currently the Director of Regional Services with the Department of Communities, Culture and Heritage for the province of Nova Scotia. Previously, she held a variety of roles within the municipal government and practiced law for a number of years. Meg has a law degree from Dalhousie and an honors in recreation management from Acadia. A devoted alum, Cuming has served on the board of the Associated Alumni of Acadia University and teaches courses part-time at Acadia as well. She has a passion for health, promotion, community development, and social justice, as well as a keen interest in politics and the workings of our democratic institution. Meg lives in Greenwich, Nova Scotia with her family. Welcome, and thank you for your time with us this evening. We'll begin by having each of the panelists take a few minutes to share with us some of their observations and perspectives to get us rolling. In alphabetical order, just to follow some semblance of order, we will go with Paul, followed by Meg, followed by Jeffrey. From there, we'll see where the questions take us. So welcome, and over to you, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks everybody for taking some time. I know we're all Zoomed out, we're Microsoft Teams'd out, we're every other online thing that can happen these days. and Zoom fatigue and Microsoft Teams fatigue are a real thing. So it's good that your cameras are off and you can just listen to us for a while. I'm not particularly expert on the United States. I've lived beside the United States, like Pierre Trudeau said in 1972 at the Washington Press Club. We're like the mouse living next to the elephant. And so I've been a mouse living next to that elephant for the vast majority of my life since I immigrated from a place where people grew up with, for generations, with an irrational hatred of one another. And I don't use hatred, I don't use it judiciously in this context. It was real. And you couldn't, if you asked them, people couldn't tell you why, because it was just other. And it was other. I'm sure they could say it was religious. Sure, they could say it had its roots in the Battle of the Boyne. But the reality is that the othering that happened there fractured a society that is continuing to have take a long time to heal. We sit in the relative comfort of bubbled existence here in Atlantic Canada, in particular in Nova Scotia, which got a shout out from the Globe and Mail editorial board today for our particular approach to the pandemic. But we share the longest undefended border in the world, and some of us might feel happy or at least comforted that border is currently largely closed, given what happened on January the 6th. I have a lot of friends in the United States, and I was talking to some of them today who are horrified at the events of January the 6th. It's ignominy for them. It's a feeling of embarrassment, of shame, and at the stress at the deepest levels. There's a saying, or technically, I guess it's a law, Miles's law, where you stand depends on where you sit. And because we sit in the relative comfort of Canada, and we believe our democratic norms are superior because we have a different system of government, responsible government, not the separation of powers model in the United States, which could actually lead to this form of feeling of tyranny that some people believe is happening in the United States. But the reality is that we share the longest undefended border. 75% of our trade, our exports go to the United States. They are our second largest trading partner in terms of returns. China has overtaken us. While we share quite a lot, and historically, our trading patterns from the east coast of Canada were north-south. They weren't east-west. We weren't trading with Ontario in the way that we were trading with Massachusetts and Maine. I think a lot of us were shaken at January the 6th as well, and watching it. I know a lot of folks were glued to the television in a way that they hadn't been since November the 5th, and since the lead up to that. If we're looking ahead, I think it may be controversial to say in a way, but if Joe Biden ends up as a president, like Joe Clark, the man from Bland, was for the period of time that he was our prime minister, and then when he was our foreign minister, that will probably be one of the most calming things that the United States could have at this period of time, given how fractured it seems to us. And I'm conscious. I want to pass it over to the panelists here, and there's lots for us to talk about. But his 47 years in government, which was used by Trump as an epithet against him in the debates, will serve him deeply well in trying to figure out how to navigate what has become a much more complex thing since January the 6th, since the Senate will only be working half-time potentially on his agenda and half-time on the proceedings of impeachment. But I'll turn it over to Meg, and we'll round on a lot of questions, I'm sure, that'll get us deeper into this.
Thank you very much, Paul, for starting us off. And just before quickly we go to Meg, if Meg and Jeffrey have reactions or comments to even Paul's comments, we'll do your introductions first, and then maybe we'll loop back around after that. So over to you, Meg.
Great. Thanks so much, Oonagh, and thanks, Paul, for that great introduction. There's so much to talk about, obviously, within this topic, this very large topic. So I just wanted to start by giving a quick caveat that Oonagh announced in my bio that I work for the province of Nova Scotia currently, but just a reminder that here I am just speaking solely as an individual, all my opinions, not speaking for the government or my department or my role in any way. So I wanted to start with that. So in thinking about what I wanted to say in sort of the intro to this large topic, I kind of had to go back to 4 years ago. Or I guess almost 4.5 years ago, to when Trump was elected. So as a woman and as an advocate for gender equity and equity in general. And as someone who has personally and professionally witnessed and experienced some of the systemic barriers to women seeking and achieving political power, in the States, in Canada, in many other parts of the world, I have to acknowledge that I literally wept the morning of November 9th, 2016, when I woke up to the reality that President Trump was going to be the president. So someone who was outwardly misogynistic in his campaign, accused of many assaults, like credible assaults on women, and just really the thought about what that meant for women and minorities over the next 4 years. And after I got myself together and cursed probably the Electoral College for a little bit, the system, I did start to think about a path, just sort of in reference to what Paul was saying around the othering. I started to really think about how to better understand the disconnect and the fear and the alienation, and maybe sometimes the simple economic opportunism that led to so many people, so many Americans voting for Trump. And I think a lot of the forces that were at play that led to that moment are some of the same forces that were at play that were exacerbated or perhaps manifested in a different way to lead to the election of Joe Biden, or maybe spurred the community organization and the Democratic Democratic Party's sort of infrastructure building that allowed for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to win the election 4 years later and make Trump a one-term president. So from my perspective, and there are so many forces at play, but I think I just want to highlight on a few that are sort of creating this greater divide within the states that has an effect on all of us, because we see lots of its impact and implications in our society as well in Canada. So I'll go quickly because I'm also cognizant of time, but just increased economic inequality, a growing gap between rich and poor, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a very few cities, companies, and individuals. The genuine fear that results from the disruption of a rapidly changing world. So understanding that the comfort of what people knew previously, changing demographics, changing ways of doing business, all of that can be quite disruptive and quite scary, and it can lead to some tribalism and to some definitely some negative reactions again, and some blame. Obviously, the rise of social networking platforms as sort of an unchecked, unvetted place for people to get the bulk of their news. And that, combined with the general myth of connection that exists online, the real lack of personal connection. It's really hard to hate someone when you know someone, and when you understand them, and when you understand the common values that you share, even across differences. So that lack of connection between individuals, and just this kind of distillation of people into snapshots and assumptions of what they represent based on what their likes are, their dislikes, where they live, or their party affiliation. And then, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the overt displays of white supremacy, coupled with the momentum of movements like Black Lives Matter, and a real reckoning with and an exposure of the racism that the U.S. was built on, and that still exists within so many of our democratic institutions, and what to do with that history, and how to reckon with it as a country and as a population, and as individuals moving forward. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I know there's going to be lots of questions and lots of good discussion, so I look forward to that over the next 45 minutes.
Thank you very much, Meg. And just so folks who maybe just joined recently, and just to reiterate, as our panelists are beginning discussions, to please launch your chat function. And if you have questions, feel free to start writing them in the chat function at any point in time, and I'll keep an eye on it and pose them to our panelists as time permits. So over to you, Jeffrey.
Thank you so much, Oonagh, and it's such a pleasure to be here with Paul and Meg as well, and also all of you watching along. I'm really excited for your questions and for the conversation that we'll have here today. Usually we hope, at least, that our elections give us some kind of clarity on the nature of America's political system. It's the one day when we can ignore the polls and the surveys and actually see as best we can what people think and the kind of political future they imagine for themselves. I do feel, though, maybe more than most, this election raises more questions than answers. And I'm not confident I understand America better today than I did a month ago or 2 months ago. What can we say then about the outcome of the election and how we got here? Well, first of all, Trump won the election in 2016 by winning important states traditionally part of the Democratic coalition, in particular Pennsylvania, Michigan, many of the states in the industrialized and deindustrializing Northeast and Northern Plains. When the time came for Biden to plan how he would attempt to defeat Trump, he faced a choice. He could either attempt to recapture those states and bring them back into the Democratic column, or he could try to win what are called the Sun Belt states. These are states like Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, Arizona. These are states that are rapidly growing in population, and Democrats hope that over time they will join their party. So it was kind of a question about where to put your eggs. Do you throw all your money at the traditional Democratic states, or do you try to throw them at this emerging coalition? Now, what happened is ultimately Biden's campaign did both because they had an absurd amount of money. But they did ultimately bank first and foremost on those states that traditionally went Democratic. Okay, so now we have kind of a sense of the basic path the campaign took. What questions can that answer for us? Well, unfortunately, not very many, because the coalition that powered Trump to his victory turned out. Trump did not lose because of a depression in his support. His voters turned out. It just happens to be the case that Biden's supporters turned out in even greater numbers, and especially in the right states. So the Trump coalition that won in 2016 is at least, well, was as of this past election day, intact. Will it be intact going forward? Can another Republican whose last name is not Trump also will that coalition into existence and have it follow him or her? We don't know the answer to that question. And that will be one of the big ones that I hope we can discuss tonight. To what extent is this a story of Trump, one that cannot be repeated by somebody else? And to what extent is it something more durable that might reflect a realignment in American politics? I think the other big question then, and the one that I hope we can return to as well, is what is the nature of Biden's coalition? Were the people that turned out for Biden in 2020 voting because they love Biden and they love the Democratic agenda, or were they voting because they hate Trump? And again, that raises the same question. Is this a story about Trump? Will these same people turn out again in 2022 or 2024? Or are they one-time, one-issue voters who will evaporate as soon as Donald J. Trump is off the ballot? We don't know the answer to that question either. And I think that when we think about what to expect, at least for the next 2 years until the next midterm elections, I think that the Biden administration and then in general, the national government will be to some extent divided around these confusing questions. We are going to have a Biden administration that I think is going to be very internally divided over how far to reach, what sorts of policies to push, because there's no clarity on how stable this coalition is. Likewise, the Democratic and Republican leaders in the House and the Senate will also be very divided about the path forward. Should Republicans double down on Trumpism and use that to power a victory in 2022? Or should they try to go moderate and maybe recapture some of those voters that left their column in this past election? Democrats have the same problem, only in reverse. And all of this is made especially salient by the fact that Congress, just numerically, is very tightly divided between the two parties. So the Senate right now is a 50-50 split. 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans. And under the Constitution, that means that Kamala Harris, the vice president, will cast the tiebreaker votes. That does give Democrats technical control, but it also means that the moderates in the two parties, those that kind of sit at the leftmost or rightmost edges of their two parties, they will have a lot of say and they can easily swing things back and forth. The House is also divided, not quite so evenly, but is also quite divided. And so I think this lack of clarity that we have because of the election is going to shape congressional behavior as well. And if I can just end with one last note about this, and I hope we can also kind of flesh this out in our conversation as well. What I'm describing, quite frankly, is a recipe for political paralysis. Okay, I think if I had to describe one word to look for, think about, it's going to be paralysis. And that's not a good thing in a pandemic. I think it's not a good thing at the best of time. We need our government to act, and we need governments to act intelligently. Paralysis does not mean things stay the same. It means nothing gets done. And things will happen that need a response. And in the absence of a response from our national government, that means other actors will have to step into the breach instead. That might be the states and the state governments. It might be the courts and increased judicial action, or we might see increased action by the executive branch acting unilaterally, all of which I hope we can talk about as well, because I think we are in for a real confusing 2 to 4 years. As crazy as the last 4 years were, well, God, I hope that the next 4 are not quite that crazy. I don't see how they could be, but we can still expect quite a bit of confusion, and I think there'll be a lot for us to chew over here tonight as a result. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Very, very insightful opening comments, and certainly I don't think there's any lack of topics or angles for discussion to go from here. And as one of you said, and quite aptly, I think there's more questions than answers. And I'm guessing that neither of our panelists have a crystal ball. I'm just checking. Nope. Okay. No crystal balls. So I guess what I'd like to do at this point is just kind of swing back around to either of the panelists on reactions to any of the other points or comments or questions or a particular angle that you'd like to dig a little in on. And great response already, Paul. Your hand is up, and over to you.
I'm just using all the tools, like raising the hand. I want to pick up on 2 different things. I pick up on lots of stuff in there. So I think one of the things that Jeffrey was sort of rounding on toward the end is we may not have the energy for it. We may not have the bandwidth for it. We may not have the kind of feeling of dread of, oh my gosh, I'm going to get deeper and deeper into this. But I think a lot of people will become a lot more expert on how the U.S. system of government works in the next couple of years. For all of our self-righteousness, and I will use that as Canadians, where we know so much about other people's systems of government, and the U.S. Like talking to the Canadians, Rick Mercer's show, where he'd go down and find that they didn't even know that Saskatchewan, was a province or whatever, and there was clearly some humor and some television production at play there, but still, a lot of Canadians don't actually know. And so a lot of people, the most Googled thing from Canada was, how does the Electoral College work in the lead up, in October, November. So I think a lot of people will be trying to figure out how Congress works, and so what's the House of Representatives, and how does it work, and how many people are in there, and what's the majority, and what does it look like, and how does the Senate work, and what's a conference committee, and the president can veto a bill, and what's a pocket veto, and all of that kind of stuff that will be important to understand about how it is that Joe Biden, walks in softly and doesn't break anything or wake anybody up, even though people have a pent-up 4 years of wanting change and wanting humanity in the office of the president and wanting authenticity. Bringing that is different than bringing a sweeping amount of change. The executive orders for the first day look sweeping, but still only partially as sweeping as they otherwise might have been in another context. And then to Meg's point, around the concentration of wealth and some of those broader issues. The Edelman Trust Barometer was just released last week, and I'll throw it up in a link up here in the chat so people can have a look at it if they want. It's an annual survey of 27 countries around the world about trust indexes with governments, NGOs, private sector, etc. One of the most troubling findings in that this year is that the most trusted institution in the world across those countries are businesses, no longer governments, no longer NGOs, and no longer the media. And there's lots of ups and downs. You could dig into the crosstabs in country by country. At least Canada's faring a little better on government trust, but CEOs are the most trusted. Businesses are the most trusted. So if concentration of wealth and economic power from the regulated, the people who are supposed to be regulated by our institutions of government, are actually the most trusted folks now. There is a serious dilemma there about how governments take that agenda or that momentum back.
Go ahead, Meg.
Sure, thanks. I was just going to respond to, I really agree with how you characterized it, Jeffrey, about the paralysis. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the interaction of Biden's kind of goal of compromise and unity and understanding of the way that government works and how, governing is compromise, combined with this need to hold his very thin coalition together in the Senate, and also combined with the fact that there has essentially been like no bipartisan cooperation in the Senate for at least I think the Republicans had a mission of blocking all of Obama's legislative agenda in his second term. So going on 8 years now and now there was no need necessarily last term or the last couple of years for them to look to that bipartisan cooperation. But I agree that it's going to be really interesting to see how the individual senators, see their own power within that environment, and then try to use that power within the context. And I agree with you too, Paul. I think it's going to be a good crash course on how U.S. government works, and I think people will be learning about it every day. And I think it's important. I mean, I think that civic engagement is important. And granted, it's not our country, but it's, as we've identified, there are huge impacts to our economy and our national defense and everything else, with the United States so close and them being this huge superpower. And I think that the other thing that we haven't talked about yet, so just to throw another little piece on there, is just, the US's reputation on the world stage and in terms of foreign relations and rebuilding that, and what that looks like, particularly I think in the context of the trust link that you just shared there, the study. So yeah, just I'll stop there because I know there's probably lots of questions.
So yes, and folks, as you're listening, again, I encourage you to engage with your questions for the panelists, either in the chat function or by raising your hand. And I'll do my best to keep an eye on the hand raising and the comments in the chat function. So I think what I might do right now at this point in time is ask a question, and I'll check the chat function after this one, and maybe put each of the panelists on the spot a wee bit by asking, what do you, so lots of allusion to sort of what it's going to look like in the next little while. If I were to ask you what you see happening in the first, say, 100 days of the Biden-Harris term, what does that look like for you? And I know none of you have crystal balls. We've ascertained that already. And maybe I'll start with you, Jeffrey, and see if you have some response to that question.
Sure. Well, I think we have a pretty good sense. He's going to be consumed by the response to COVID. I think nothing else will take his attention from that. The response will be, the first 100 days will be about speeding up the distribution and delivery of vaccines, and the economic stimulus package that is in the process of being shepherded through Congress. The shape of this package is going to change with the new Congress coming in. It will create new opportunities now that the Senate is at least by a razor-thin margin in Democratic control. We can expect it to probably be a bit more generous, especially for state and local governments, than the package that was being proposed by the Senate under Republican leadership of Mitch McConnell. So we'll probably see Biden focus overwhelmingly on delivering vaccines and then shepherding that package through Congress and getting it passed as soon as possible. I can't imagine anything else beyond a couple executive orders, some which might be quite important, but ultimately there's nothing else that he really needs to think about or is going to spend his political capital on besides dealing with this enormous mess that's landing on his doorstep day one.
Thank you. Meg or Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jeffrey. It's vaccines. 100 million vaccines in the first 100 days. And, if Pfizer has production slowdowns, like we're seeing now, and like we have premiers issuing news releases saying we're going to run out of vaccine tonight. This is Justin Trudeau's fault, not saying that, but, imputing that, didn't negotiate well enough, or Anita Anand, or, any other member of Executive Council, Privy Council federally. So yes, vaccines, there is a list, to Jeffrey's point, in the New York Times today. You can just read the agenda. Ron Klain, the chief of staff, the transition memo was obviously deliberately leaked to show what executive orders will be issued on the first day. There's some irony. Certainly Democratic presidents have used executive authority, significantly, but that door was kicked open by Dick Cheney, on behalf of W, on behalf of George W. Bush. Barr was hired as Attorney General specifically to expand executive authority and expand the interpretation of executive authority that would allow Trump to actually, prosecute his agenda, if he could be said to have had an agenda that was focused or that was ever, the same day to day or minute to minute. So I think those are things, but, I think from a Canadian perspective, one of the things we will be looking for, is that soothsaying sort of feeling that the president's first trip is going to be to Canada. Well, it's probably not going to be a trip for a little while, but the first phone call as president, or the first, that gesture, that will be complicated when he issues an executive order, as has been reported, killing the Keystone XL pipeline on the first day in office. That he needs to do that for a certain amount of his quote unquote base, or for certain Democrats, in particular in Congress, who he's looking to carry a lot of water in a 7-seat majority in the House of Reps, and for certain senators as well. So I think Trudeau and the bromance that he had with Obama, I think that will be watered down slightly with Keystone coming through on day one. We're going to have to suck it up, but that's going to complicate the internal politics of Canada, and therefore our, and I see Meg here, so I'll hop off. Our relationship in response to that is just going to get muddied.
No, I'm good. I don't have anything significant to add. I was going to mention Keystone, and you just did. So I think we can move on to another question.
And just in response, Paul, about his first trip being to Canada, and certainly it won't be until the travel is a little bit more flexible, but apparently politicians can travel wherever and whenever they want. So we'll move to the first question that we have in the side function, and it's from Rod Morrison, who says, many thanks to all the panelists. Jeffrey suggested that we're in for a confusing 2 to 4 years. One of the variables is likely to be the ongoing poisonous influence of Trump. He has raised over $200 million, ostensibly for legal challenges, but most of which will be available to him as a political slush fund. How do the panelists see him influencing the agenda? And was the 6th of January a watershed in how influential he will be?
Meg, you want to go first?
Sure. I will go first. Yeah, no, I think he's going to be hugely influential. I think there's a major fear of sitting congressmen, mostly congressmen in the Republican Party, that if they lean towards any sort of moderation or go against the Trump agenda, then they're going to get primaried in their next, whenever they're next up for election, whether it's in the midterms or in 4 years' time. So I think that we saw evidence of his influence even as essentially a lame duck president, in terms of how many Republican congressmen and senators voted against impeachment, even after they themselves were victims of an insurrection at the Capitol where they worked. So I think that was really telling. Obviously, things change quickly in the political environment, so nothing's for sure, but that's my perspective from here.
And Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I think to be very direct, Rod. I think one good part of January the 6th, and I don't say that there could be in fact be any good out of a situation where 5 people died, and where the seat of liberty from a symbolic standpoint for the U.S. Was breached and besmirched, and all of those adjectives. I think casual Trumpism is dead, right? So Ken Boysenkool, conservative in Canada, worked for Harper, worked for various other folks. He's a visiting professor at McGill. He called out his fellow conservatives in Canada last week for their casual Trumpisms that he, as a conservative, is going to start calling it out. Because I think there was quite a lot of casual Trumpism for 4 years in the United States and in Canada. So one maybe good piece of news is you're now with him or against him. Like there isn't you're on the side of people who trod in and killed a police officer and various other folks in the U.S. Capitol. That said, he still has, Pew Research Trust poll of this week, shows that still 64% of Republicans believe he either definitely or probably won the election. Right. So there is a lot of a hangover of people who disbelieve the media, disbelieve reality, and certified reality in terms of certified electoral college votes, et cetera. So he will have a tremendous amount of influence, and he will primary people. That is exactly where that influence will be leveraged. No longer get his own TV station. Maybe it'll just be the South Florida, Mar-a-Lago but he will be a well-funded unless he is taken down by federal prosecutors, if he doesn't proactively pardon himself tomorrow, or he's taken up on some state level offenses somewhere, he will continue to wield massive amounts of influence, and he will be, maybe more pressingly in the news significantly for the next 3 months. So as much as he will hate the characterization of him, he will love being in the news, because any news is good news for Trump and the Trump brand as far as he's concerned. And so the fact that he will get to take up 50% of the airtime or so, if Biden kind of gets his way and says, look, confirm some of my nominees, the pressing people that I really need done to run departments and get competent people back in. So spend half time on that and half time on impeachment and send the article up and just get moving. If that's what happens, still 50% of the airtime will be, for the salacious details of those things.
And Dr. Sachs, any response or reactions?
Yeah, I mean, boy, it's really hard to say. I think, I guess one thing we can say is that if there's one thing that we know about Trump, it's that he demands loyalty and he punishes its absence. So as he kind of surveys the rubble of this campaign and those that might not have supported him to the extent that he wishes, it sounds already like he is going to make it his business to punish the Republican candidates and some of the incumbents in Georgia and Arizona. In Georgia, he feels that the Republican Party did not back him sufficiently in some of his lawsuits that he lodged to overturn election results. Same in Arizona, to some extent as well in Pennsylvania. And so I think we can expect him to use his influence. We don't know the scale of it, but his influence to hurt Republicans in those states, like, for instance, Georgia Republican Governor Brian Kemp. And I think this will be an enormous headache for the Republican Party. Up until now, there were enough occasions and enough overlap between the interests of Trump and the interests of congressional Republicans that their paths have now diverged. The interests of Trump look very different from those of the Republican Party overall. And so I think there'll be times when they'll overlap. He will want Congress to protect some of his legacy. But I think unless he decides he wants to run again in 2024, he has no real interest to do the will of the party anymore the way that most former presidents do. They try to be good soldiers for their party after they leave office. So I think he's going to play a bit of a spoiler role in many of these races, and he will attempt to hurt people, even in his own party, who he feels were not sufficiently loyal to him when his back was against the wall. And I think that will be a real dynamic to look for going forward.
So in order of the questions that are appearing on the slide, the next one is from Niall Clark-Black, who says he is wondering what your opinion is on what the outcome of the impeachment trial will be. So I'll toss that out there and see if I've got reactions. Paul, your hand is up. Is that on this one?
If I left my hand up, sorry. That's actually my son, so I'll allow Dr. Sachs to take that question first, or Meg to take it. I have a defined opinion. I think he knows it.
Great. Thanks for that transparency. Go ahead, either Jeffrey or Meg.
Sure. Well, let me just say, what an intelligent question. It bears all the hallmarks of a good rearing by responsible and intelligent parents. So well done. Yeah, that's a great question. What is going to be the outcome of the impeachment trial? I wish I knew. I'd make a fortune on the betting markets. I think that, let me be my most cynical with you right now and say that I think the momentum towards bipartisan condemnation of Trump is already dissipating. I think we saw a moment after the January 6th attack that really represented kind of a break. And I think there was momentum. We saw it very early on. There were rumors from unnamed sources, but well-placed sources in the press, that there was real momentum within the Republican Party to break with the president and to support an impeachment vote. Well, in the final analysis, only 10 House Republicans ended up supporting impeachment. Now the impeachment vote goes to the Senate. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, under the Constitution, the House of Representatives impeaches. And that just means the president's fitness for office is on the line. His role is on the line. Now it goes to the Senate, and the Senate conducts a trial. And in that trial, they weigh the evidence, they listen to testimony, and they decide whether or not they want to remove the president from office, or in this case, bar the president from ever running for any federal office again in the future. And if that vote were taken a week ago, I think it's a good bet that you would find enough Republicans willing to break with the president to formally remove him. But I'm no longer confident that's the case. And I think if I had to be that cynical self, I would say it's going to fragment mainly, although not exclusively, along partisan lines. And I don't think it's going to really represent a real repudiation. Basically, what I'm saying is I think most Republicans are going to continue to back President Trump even after he leaves office.
I guess I'll jump in because, Paul, you said your son already knows your opinion, but yeah, I think it's really interesting. I was actually, I have, my cynicism probably runs even deeper because I was cynical about even the rumors of breaking at the time with the Republicans and certainly some of the, the empty statements, or what seemed like empty statements from people like McConnell and Lindsey Graham and people who I think are quite culpable themselves of stowing the flames of what eventually became the insurrection with their support for Trump's unfounded claims around the stealing of the election. And so I guess I think that on one hand, some of his most ardent supporters, like Ted Cruz, should probably support his impeachment, and then they'll for sure not have to run against him in 2024. But I think that realistically, it would require too much introspection and too much culpability on the parts of the other people within the system, within the Republican Party, who enabled Trump's behavior, who didn't just, weren't just complicit in their silence, but actually, we're feeding the masses the lies that Trump was peddling. And, that's information coming from trusted leadership. And you can't, I do have a lot of empathy, let's just say, for those people who are hearing that from their trusted leaders at the time. So anyway, I kind of went on a tangent away from impeachment there, but yeah, I think the likelihood of the Senate trial actually resulting in confirming the impeachment is unlikely to result in a conviction.
Paul?
Yeah, I think we can give the answer we would like, and it's not the answer that we will ultimately get. 17 senators having to break, is a high bar, because that's just for everybody's process. That's because you need a supermajority, you need the 66 to get that bar. Now, if that were to happen, you actually only need a simple majority to ban him from office. So in terms of the consequence, so impeachment, the vote to impeach is the one thing. But if that were to happen, if you had enough Republicans cross, party lines, if it could be said that it's a party line vote, which to Jeffrey's point and Meg's point, I think fundamentally, unfortunately, it likely will be closer to. And in part, you can just go down the list and look at what senators are up for re-election, because as we know, the U.S. system, House of Representatives, all of them are re-elected every 2 years. They're all up. The president's every 4 years, and senators are every 6, but they're staggered. And that was the way the system was set up to ensure accountability and checks and balances. So when you look at the list, there's a lot of states there that were tight swing states, that were states that flipped Democratic this time. Reverend Warnock will be up in 2 years. Senator Loeffler would have been, but Reverend Warnock will be up for re-election in 2 years, not 6. He doesn't get a full 6-year term at this point because of that quirk in Georgia. So I think, if I were laying money on it, I don't think 17 will cross in order to allow just the 51 to bar him from federal office, unless there are much more damning media reports that come out that point to various things. But I think the moment would have been last week where you would have gotten close to it. But unfortunately, I don't necessarily think that we will make it there.
Thank you, Paul. And then moving on to the next question in the chat function, and I think I'll start by asking it of you, Paul, and then see if there are reactions from Meg and Jeffrey. It's from Mike Morris, who says, do you think that the expectation of CEOs to step into the current leadership vacuum will become a long-term thing, as reported in the report that Paul circulated? It is interesting to think about this while also considering the debate around the appropriateness of Twitter's decision to mute Trump.
I mean, it's like any of these. I think we can give, if I had a crystal ball, or if I knew this, I'd be rich, etc. I wish I could read the future, read the tea leaves accurately. I think there has been a trend over time where we've seen moments like Walkerton. We've seen lots of other moments that have been sort of watersheds where trust in institutions. So in those cases, trust in institutions, that the private sector institutions has dipped. The long-term trends are what are probably more indicative. You can see them in the Edelman report. Toward the back end, the trends on media are there. That is probably the most troubling to me, frankly. Like something like 18% of Trump voters and people who voted for Trump believe the media is trustworthy today. It's not like massively higher for Democrats. It is certainly materially higher, but it is not like a home run at 90%, unfortunately, either. So I think a lot of CEOs will take that mantle because some of them want to be able to advance an agenda against regulation of certain sectors, against certain kinds of policies, and they will probably want to associate it with brand. There's a lot of, talk to our friends in the business school at Acadia or at other institutions, and they will talk to you about the research on, associations between leaders and brands, and expecting leaders and brands to be responsible these days, and what responsibility means, and imbuing that, or the students who are in the ESST program at Acadia. Lots of folks would have very defined views on that. So I think they will take up the mantle. I'm not sure it will be for a long-term good because, are they as concerned about housing, unaffordability of housing? Only if it affects their employees, only if it affects their ability to make the product, to deliver the service. Let's look at Amazon. Do we believe Jeff Bezos should have the platform that he has, given what he's done, vis-a-vis his workers? Who is we in that context? Do you as an individual? Do I? And that'll be a where you stand depends on where you sit thing. Where do you fall down on that kind of question? So I think they will take up the mantle. I'm not sure it will be for long-term good in a lot of cases, but in other cases, it will draw them closer. And the one point I wanted to make earlier is Brian Stevenson founded the Equal Justice Initiative in the United States. So Brian spoke at a meeting I was at in 2016, or it was early 2017, right after Trump was elected. The movie Just Mercy, which you might have seen, or the book Just Mercy, which if you haven't read it, is tremendous. Brian started this to help people who were wrongly convicted. And his message in late 2016, early 2017 was get proximate. That is the only way we bridge that divide. That is the only way we stop the othering. That is the only way we recognize in others similarities which at first blush don't seem to exist between someone who identifies as an alt-right person and someone who identifies as Antifa. But the reality is they have grandmothers. The reality is they've undergone adversity in their schooling. The reality is there are lots of common points there, and I think that is the way. Sort of getting proximate in every possible context is the only real way through this, not CEOs using the bully pulpit that they have.
Thank you, Paul. Unless I see a hand from either Jeffrey or Meg, I'm going to continue to go through the questions. We have a few there, and lo and behold, the time is going by quickly. So I'm going to direct the next one at you, Meg, and it's from Reed McNeil, a bit of a segue from the last question about Twitter. And he says, "Good evening, panelists, and thank you for dedicating your time. My question is about the recent ban of Trump off of every social or every major media platform. As an advocate of free speech, this terrifies me. No matter where you fall on the political spectrum or circle, removing the ability of someone in politics to voice their opinion seems wrong to me, no matter how wrong they are. Could I get your thoughts on this?"
Oh, sure. This is just a nice light one on freedom of speech. Well, yeah, that's a great question. And I think that line, I think that's a really, really difficult, complex thing to navigate because, the ultimate decision of Twitter was that Trump was inciting violence. And, there was actually nothing in his, like the tweets that actually ended up, sort of the timing of the ban was obviously due to the insurrection and the attack and his, potential role in that. But I think that the reality is that, it wasn't that different than anything he'd been doing in the past 4 years. So to Paul's point around, the winds of responsibility that CEOs interpret as what is responsible for their organization and their shareholders, and where are those winds blowing at the time. I think that's a lot of what's happening. Personally, I think there is a real danger in blanket tolerance without accountability. And, but where that accountability lies with respect to hate speech and free speech is definitely more than we have time for in the next 9 minutes. But I think it's something really that we need to explore. And I think you're right to be concerned about it. And yeah, I'll leave it there and hand it over to someone else.
So again, if I see reactions from the other panelists, certainly we'll include that. There is a sort of a second part to that question that I'll possibly just toss out to the three of you in general and see if there are any either reactions to Meg's comments or further comments that you'd like to make. And it's from Charles Douglas, who says, going off of Reed's question, how does the banning of Trump off social media play into the future of politics regarding the limits of speech as a person in power without checks and balances? So I'll just lob that one out there and see if I have any takers.
Sure. Well, I mean, maybe just so we're all on the same page here. What I think both Charles and Rita and also Meg are referring to is not just this decision by Twitter, the social media company, to ban President Trump, but a simultaneous purge from Twitter, from many other social media sites, of thousands and thousands of accounts that were either accused of inciting violence or disseminating misinformation about the election, or even those that were aligned with a very Baroque, confusing conspiracy theory called QAnon, which I'm not going to really get into here because this is too elaborate. But anyway, suffice to say, what we saw was this big multi-platform purge. And I think just one other layer on top of that is we didn't just see individuals get purged from the internet this past week. We also saw a company purged, a social media company called Parler, which is like Twitter, only it caters kind of more exclusively to the far right. And it was basically kicked off its ability to connect to the internet. Again, there's no need to get into the specifics, but it was Amazon that did so. So what I think we saw here is we saw tech giants really flexing their might. And if you like the outcome, maybe you have no problem with that. But I think both Charles and Reed are right to be concerned. Meg is right to be concerned. I'm concerned because what we're seeing here is the power of big corporations. And the reality is you can't operate a business, you can't run for public office unless you have a presence on these platforms. And I don't know, do we really want to give big corporations with profit motives control over who has access to the digital public sphere? I don't think many of us do. I don't know, though, what the right solution is, because as Meg pointed out, some of the things that were being said on these websites are pretty inflammatory, and they violate the pretty clear terms of service of these private corporations. So how do you balance these two competing goods? The good of a healthy democratic public sphere where everybody can speak versus the rights of private corporations to withhold their services from those that they wish to withhold. I don't know how you balance that. I think that's a question for ethicists and philosophers, but I think it is one that we're going to be dealing with a lot more because this problem is not going away.
Paul?
I don't think it's just a question as much as it should be first in the first order for ethicists and philosophers, and then we fall down where we're going to fall down legislatively. It will be a question for legislators in the United States very quickly, because that is in fact one of the things on which there is some form of bipartisan consensus. It's not fully formed yet, but when you look at if you go to the back end of that Edelman Trust Barometer link, you'll find that one of the casualties of the last year from a trust perspective is big tech companies. Big tech companies. So what do politicians like to do? They like to be popular and populist. And I'm speaking writ large, not of every politician I've ever met or known, in terms of good people getting in there to do the right thing. Where you stand depends on where you sit about what the right thing is a lot of that time. But in the US, there's a lot of consensus on that. And so people have been calling for further regulation of Facebook, of Twitter, of WhatsApp, all owned by the same Instagram, many of which are owned by the same institution, by Facebook, and there will be some major legislative action on that in the United States in the next couple of years. So the question, in part, that was clearly the cynical side of me says that was a major preemptive push on the part of Twitter and on the part of Facebook to say, hey, look, we can kick people out, we can police ourselves. Don't come breaking down our door telling us what to do. We can do the right thing. And as a former boss of mine said, maybe that's proof that you can do the right thing when you've exhausted every other option, as opposed to doing the right thing when it counts.
Thanks, Paul. We have one last question in the chat function, and I'm going to address it to you, Jeffrey, and then see if we have responses from the other two. It's from Elizabeth Baldwin, who says, what does that dissipation of support for impeachment teach us here in Canada regarding the larger Republican massive acquaintances to Trump's criminality to maintain power? Are we better positioned to stand up to what behaviors and policies are clearly not in the country's and citizens' best interest?
Wow, that's a great question. So I would say this: the reason that one of the root causes of all these dysfunctions in U.S. politics is partisan polarization. The reason why so few Republicans are willing to break with Trump is because all the incentives electorally are to hew to the party line. Now, in Canada, we have very tight party discipline, and we have partisanship here, absolutely. I don't know if we have partisanship to the same extent that they do in the United States. In part because we have a different institutional configuration here that permit people to cross the aisle more easily. We have a media environment that is less polarized and is more local. I guess another point I would make, putting on my comparative hat, is that in Canada, we have much stronger regional identity in political terms. So regionalism is a much more powerful force here, and that moderates the force of national polarization that we see in the United States. So in the US now, it used to be possible 40 years ago for a Democrat to win congressional races in a Republican leading district because he or she delivered the bacon. They brought home the goods. We don't see that anymore because politics is nationalized. And that's why the acquiescence to Trump is just something that every Republican has to do. In Canada, we do not see that same kind of nationalization of politics to quite the same extent. We see more regional variation. And as a result, I think, I don't want to exaggerate our advantages, but we do have some more barriers in place that prevent the kind of rabid partisanship that we see in the United States here. But why don't I leave it there, and I'll let Meg or Paul take a stab at that question.
Any takers?
I know Paul probably has some opinions on this, so I'm gonna flip it over to him. I'm good. I agree with you. I think our systems are different, and I think that there's I think less of a likeliness that we could get into that situation. Although I do think it's another cautionary tale that we shouldn't we should pay attention to in terms of that polarization, because I think there are forces that are sort of more nuanced and more subtle in our society, but that are creeping up in Canadian society too, that I think could lead us to more of a polarization and a divisiveness. And I think that some of that regionally the regional divide is some of where that polarization starts to happen a little bit, and what the impact of that will be, or can be in the way that our system works, is certainly something to watch. So I didn't really flip it right over to you, Paul. But,
Quite all right, Meg. Over to you, Paul, for any comments.
Meg, you're spot on. I think I had a call with a friend of mine from the United States, called me 3 or 4 months ago and said, look, I think we got to move up. I can't stand this, can't stand what will happen, et cetera. And by the end of the conversation, I had done the Irish pessimistic thing where I had kind of talked him through how deeply problematic things could get in Canada. And he's sort of like, what are you talking about? And, I walked him through SNC level, and I walked him through things from 20, 30 years ago and a path. I think obviously we're very different. Responsible government system is very different. But as my students last term in Canadian politics, would have observed, we have a prime minister who has a ton more power than a U.S. president, bar none, unquestionably, to run the legislature, to appoint, and to through executive action undertake major things. We've seen it. We've seen lots of examples. I don't need to go through them. So I think we can't make a comparison on a separation of powers model where they were set up where the Supreme Court and we could get there. And I'd love to hear Meg's views and others on this if we have time. On whether we're going to get any Supreme Court appointees under Biden, certainly before the midterms or after, and what that might mean and what that might look like. But when it comes to Canada, our systems are just so different that it's hard to compare. However, Justin Trudeau has exerted a significant amount of power that some would say abrogated, authority that's extended under the Constitution. A number of premiers would say that. They weren't saying that when they were getting a lot of money and when they didn't have a lot of things that they could do. And now they're saying that in spades. The crisis we're about to have on our federalism here is authority and power, and what Section 91 and Section 92 mean in the context of where we are today. So I don't think it would allow criminality to creep in. I think that would be, against Canadian values, broadly speaking, and people wouldn't stand for it. The Governor General could intervene, other folks could intervene, and create a difference in that situation. But in terms of concentration of power, absolutely.
And I certainly think that the topic, without stating the absolute obvious, was really quite large for just an hour's discussion. I am cognizant of the time, though, and recognize that we certainly have had a lot of questions, angles, variables, perspectives presented and talked about this evening. And I wonder if it's way too broad to just ask for a few more minutes from each of you for any closing comment. And I know, how do you wrap up this hour discussion in a couple of minutes? I recognize that that's not possible, but maybe a particular point or a particular reaction that you'd like to share with our guests as we wrap up for the evening. Too broad?
Sure. Well, I'll go. I think I'll just make a note of, I think someone, I can't remember, I'm sorry. I think Jeffrey, it was you, or maybe Paul, sorry, about talking about Biden being sort of this bland, veteran politician and what that will mean as a calming influence. And I think that we've heard Biden and Harris speak broadly about unity, and we've had unity being called on from both sides of the aisle. And I think that in order to kind of rebuild that potential unity, there does need to be some accountability as a first step. And there does need to, be that connection across as humans. And I know it sounds like, it maybe sounds a little bit trite, but really, I think that's what we've lost. We lost it through social media platforms, and then we really lost it through the pandemic. And so I think the real challenge for politicians in Canada and in the US is going to be that ability to connect with individuals and then to connect with each other across party lines, really as people, to start to build back that grassroots kind of values-based progress towards unity and compromise that is essential in order to not have the paralysis that Jeffrey alluded to at the beginning of the conversation. So I think that's sort of my closing for now. But I would love to stay on for 3 more hours and talk about this, but that's probably not what we're going to do. Another time. We'll have to do it another time.
Well, I think there's another session brewing very, very quickly. Thank you for that, Meg. Much appreciated. Paul or Jeffrey?
Well, I guess I'll just say really quick. I agree with pretty much everything that the panelists have said, and I think just to maybe circle back to, I think it was a point that Meg made earlier about economic inequality. What I was kind of replaying in my head how I want to answer this last question about whether or not we are inoculated in Canada from some of the forces driving Trump and the acquiescence of Republicans to Trumpism. I think a big question that we need to ask ourselves is whether or not we are doing enough in this country to address economic inequality, because I think the political science research says that this yawning inequality and economic insecurity in the United States is really responsible for driving many of the voters into Trump's column in 2016 and 2020. I don't want to reduce everything just to dollars and cents, but that was a big issue, probably one of the major ones. And I think that's where we can kind of go from here. To the extent that what we're seeing in America is a result of institutional problems, well, they'll need institutional solutions. And that's very difficult because institutions are very difficult to change in America under the constitutional system, and in terms of stakeholders, it's hard to make changes to rules. That's why if there's going to be a change, it's probably going to have to be changing the interests and incentives of voters. And I think that will be the job of a generation, to maybe try to do something about this economic inequality that is crippling America's party system and really leading to so many of the pathologies that we're seeing today. So maybe that's something else then that we can think about in terms of Canada. To what extent are we doing enough to address economic inequality and thereby maybe inoculate ourselves a bit more effectively against some of the problems we're seeing south of the border? So I'll leave that there.
Appreciate that very, very much, Jeffrey. And as both a parent and somebody who works in a post-secondary institution, I kind of feel like you're sort of going to the next generation. Here, we've left you this to fix. Good luck. Paul, over to you.
To take that very point, I've got kids, some of whom might be headed down the road to Acadia in the next couple of years, and on their way, in this world. And what I don't like from them, from kids that I've coached in soccer, from all of those younger people in our lives, is the idea and the belief that they're sort of like, yeah, you left us an environment that is falling down around us. You left us a situation, or you're leaving us a situation where Indigenous peoples in Canada are still not a founding people under our Constitution. We haven't implemented most of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Economic inequality and kind of a list that goes on. We don't get to do, I'm out. Nobody gets to do that at 40, at 50, especially not, frankly, and for all of those who have earned some rest after a lifetime of work, still not. That doesn't, getting proximate is actually modeled by those older folks among us whose views are probably hardened, whose cognitive flexibility might not be quite what it was when we were 18 or 22 or 24, and we're having debates at Acadia with people with very different views from us, and trying to understand where that comes from. It is our job, all of us, to get proximate, not to say, okay, I'm not flying to the US for the next 4 years after Trump gets elected. No, exactly the wrong thing to do. We need to figure out ways, and to Meg's point, and I don't say this lightly, there does have to be an awful lot of accountability built into how it is. It can't be giving people a pass and saying, okay, they didn't know better. There were people like David Black, a piece in the New York Times, which was put back up on the New York Times site, who was the godson of David Duke, the father of the white supremacist movement in the United States, who left that movement, who publicly renounced it because he had conversations with people at university that opened him to a perspective that he was not brought up on. So yes, education is it, but education not in a formalized, only post-secondary or public school sense, but in our backyards, in our neighborhoods, on our ferries. All of those circumstances are where we're building the resiliency of our population, not to other one another and to put ourselves in a similar situation.
Excellent, optimistic viewpoint to end off on, Paul, and I appreciate that. We have gone overtime, surprisingly, and certainly think there's plenty of fodder for upcoming sessions or future sessions on the same topics, similar topics, and I think it will continue to get interesting in the next little while. Excellent discussion from our panelists. Thank you very much for the questions from our guests on the call this evening and for joining us. Thank you to our panelists for the time that you've shared with us this evening and with the Acadia University alumni community. Appreciate it very much. I made mention of a draw earlier in the session, and our winner for this evening's draw is Ramona Jennings, who joined us this evening. So Ramona will send that out in the mail to you, and I certainly am sure that most of us, if not all of us on the call this evening, will be watching and listening very intently in the next couple of days to see what else is going to come to fruition. So thank you all. I'm going to stop the recording and officially end it here. Certainly, as we would in a live event, if you want to stick around for a few minutes to see if there's anyone who wants to chat via the actual function, then please do. But certainly, thank you everybody for joining us, and I hope to see you all again soon. And please stay safe and stay well.